Just for 1 minute. Great. Okay. Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. Soy Carlos Heredia, profesor del Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas. I want to welcome to this webinar, Is There a Road to Peace in Afghanistan? We have a very distinguished panel. We have my colleague, Dr. Catherine Andrews from the History Department at CIDE. We have Dr. Ijaz Nabi, a professor at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Lahore. Good evening, Ijaz, in Lahore. We have Dr. Mauricio Meshulam de la Universidad Iberoamericana del Centro de Investigaciones para la Paz. Welcome, Mauricio. And we have many academics, diplomats, guests who will be joining us this morning. This is the order in which the panelists will intervene. First, I will give the floor to Dr. Nabi, provided that he's still there. And he will do an overview, a geopolitical overview of the region, focusing on a map of Afghanistan. But you've blacked out, Ijaz, if you can hear me. Then we will go to the historical perspective from Dr. Andrews. Then we will jump back to the geopolitical perspective nowadays with Dr. Meshulam. That will take care of the first 45 minutes of the conversation. And then the last 30 minutes, we will engage in Q&A with the participants. So we're trying to get Dr. Nabi back. I hope he will be able to reconnect momentarily. But this is a great privilege, a great honor to have such distinguished panelists. May I emphasize, may I underscore that we have the perspective of scholars from different disciplines. We have a historian, we have an expert geopolitical analyst who has focused in his work on terrorism and peace. And we have a very distinguished economist who has worked on public policy in the region, in South and Central Asia, including, of course, Afghanistan. And it's very important that in Mexico, we hear other views, not only those locally or those in our part of the world, but rather the perspective from the region. And that's what the participation of Dr. Nabi brings into the picture. So while Ijaz, Dr. Nabi reconnects, I'm going to share screen and bring us up to, this is what I want to emphasize. Can you see my screen, Catherine?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the map of Afghanistan. It's, of course, in the crossroads of Eurasia. It is halfway between Lisbon in Portugal, if you go to the Atlantic Ocean, and Busan in South Korea, if you go to the Pacific Ocean. And it's a crossroads of civilizations, a crossroads of merchants, of warriors, or of traders, of diplomats. And that's how we will find out how an impoverished country is so important geopolitically for its neighbors. I'm just wishing that Dr. Nabi can reconnect.
I'm connected.
Okay, please proceed, Dr. Nabi.
Okay. Thank you, Carlos, and my apologies for this bad connection. Normally, I think it's great to start with this map, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. I think it's important to see, aside from the history that Carlos talked about, it's really important to see the present context. Afghanistan lies in the center of a geopolitically extremely important area. West, you have Iran. Iran has its own concerns about what happens in Afghanistan. You have China, and you see the Western Chinese. China has a huge concern because
well, the sound is coming and going. Dr. Nabi was just describing which countries are, as you can see in the map. Afghanistan is embedded between Iran and Pakistan. Afghanistan and Pakistan share a long border. And if you go to northwestern Pakistan or northeastern Afghanistan, you will see this tip that I'm pointing in the map. That is a crucial crossroads, a crucial point for South and Central Asia. This is where the Hindu Kush mountains are located, and the Khyber Pass. The Khyber Pass has been a geopolitical crossroads of very important implications, military implications, governance implications, geopolitical implications that we will go back to. Then we have all the nations that the Istans, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, that also have boundaries with Afghanistan. Of course, the tip of southwestern China. This is okay. Go ahead, Ijaz, please. Maybe you can disconnect your camera and just leave the sound.
Let's keep our fingers. Yeah. I'll do that. Okay. So, and then of course you've got the Central Asian republics to the north, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, but importantly you have Russia above that. And Russia, despite what happened in the 1980s, Russia remains a very interested party in what happens in Afghanistan. And of course, the most important in terms of the impact of what happens in Afghanistan is Pakistan, which lies to the east and south of Afghanistan. It's important to remember this geography. It's also important to keep in mind history, long history. Afghanistan has had a huge impact on Pakistan and India in pre-1947, the Indian subcontinent. There have been waves and waves of migrations from Central Asia and Afghanistan region. The Mughal Empire, the famous Mughal Empire of India, originated in an area north of Kabul and south of Tajikistan. And subsequently, the Durrani Empire, which has a direct link with what's going on today, the Durrani Kingdom was established in the 18th century. And all of that history is very much alive and well in that region and has a bearing on what happens today. Afghanistan is an ethnic mix. It is the largest ethnic community of Afghanistan, the Pashtuns, about half the population. And then you've got three other important ethnic minorities. You've got the Tajiks to the north, you've got Uzbeks to the northwest, and you've got in the center, Hazaras. Hazaras are important because aside from ethnic complexity, there is also the sectarian complexity. The Hazara group are Shia. Iran's interest in Afghanistan is to protect the Shia minority, and of course, the almost 3 million refugees that are in Iran since the jihad that was fought by the fathers and uncles of the Taliban, who were known as the Mujahideen, who defeated the Soviet Union. So there are 3 million refugees, 2.5 million refugees in Iran. There are 3 million refugees in Pakistan who have been there for about 20 years or so. It's important to remember this because it has a huge bearing on what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. So given this geography, given this ethnic composition, the next layer that we need to unravel is that among the Pashtuns, there is a divide. You've got highly urbanized, relatively richer Pashtuns, Pashtun sub-tribes who are the elite of Kabul. And then you've got rural Pashtuns, poorer Pashtuns in the south and in the west and in the east. And these Pashtuns stride the border area of Pakistan and have their cousins living on the other side, which is Pakistan. So you've got a 50% of the population or slightly more of Afghanistan are Pashtuns. The majority of Pashtuns actually live in Pakistan, which is why Pakistan becomes a very important player in all of this, in the conflict and what happened subsequently. Now, when the Soviet, against the Soviet occupation, all the interests were aligned. The American interest, the interest of the Pashtuns, and indeed other minorities in Afghanistan, and Pakistan's interests. All the interests were aligned, and together the Soviet Union was defeated and Soviets withdrew, and subsequently there was a breakup of the Soviet Union because all interests were aligned. Then came a period of about 5 years or a little longer when there was warfare among the ethnic groupings in Afghanistan. Things had not been settled. That was the time to engage, sort of like this. That was the time to engage, but instead the Clinton administration chose to withdraw completely from Afghanistan, and a huge vacuum was left with people armed to the teeth, very few resources, huge infighting, complete breakdown of law and order in Afghanistan, brutality on a large scale. People couldn't move within the country. And then the Taliban movement started. These were the younger generations who had fought along with the Mujahideen against the Soviets. They knew how to fight, who were fed up of what was happening in Afghanistan. And they came together and formed groups and started to restore basic law and order. Now, they came steeped in a very conservative interpretation of Islam, a very conservative, but an interpretation that seemed to coincide well with the belief systems of the tribal areas. So along with that extremely conservative interpretation of Islam, which resulted in brutal justice, but there was a sense of justice, and they spread very rapidly in Afghanistan, and by 2000 and by 99, 2000, they were in complete control. Now, that's when the international jihad found sanctuaries there, and September 11 happened, and the United States decided to occupy Afghanistan with the intention of defeating the Taliban and eventually modernizing Afghanistan according to the image of modernization that was in the minds of the neoconservative groups that had been central in making the strategy. Unlike the Soviet jihad, the war on terror was extremely unpopular among the Pashtuns, whether they were Pashtuns on the Afghan side or the Pashtuns in Pakistan. Pakistan's largest city, the port of Karachi, with a population of about 11 million people, it's the largest Pashtun city. It's not the dominant Pashtun city. Pashtuns are a minority in that city, but for the Pashtuns, it is the largest city. So when there is discontent, when there is this unhappiness about the war on terror, it touches the nerve, the raw nerve in Pakistan very, very quickly, and threatens to become a hugely disruptive, hugely destabilizing element in Pakistan, let alone Afghanistan. In fact, a well-known general, Pakistani general, said at the time that this is now a circus, and we will have to learn to ride on two horses at the same time. One horse is the United States, and the other horse is the Pashtun tribes. We'll have to find a way somehow between that, and sometimes we'll fall, and sometimes we'll stay with it. Otherwise, the consequences for Pakistan will be disastrous. Now, I don't know at what time. At some point, Carlos, I'm sure you want me to stop, and you want to.
Yes. Why don't we stop here, and I will get back to you with some of the questions that I am about to display on screen.
Okay.
But first, thank you, Ijaz. This was very enlightening and provided great background for what Dr. Andrews will discuss, which is the historic perspective. So talking about the historic perspective, I just want to bring to your attention the fact that Afghanistan is in the middle of the old and the new Silk Road, precisely in the middle. And this is the great geopolitical initiative that China deployed starting in 2015 that goes from one extreme to the other of Eurasia, and also has enormous implications for road, train, maritime trade in the Indian Ocean. So this is how Afghanistan is precisely in the midst of the Silk Road, the old one and the new one. And Ijaz has covered question number one. How did the Taliban movement start? In what context? What are the interests of the countries surrounding landlocked Afghanistan? Then there's a key question, number three, that we will cover down the road towards the end of the discussion. Will the Taliban victory result in a stable Afghanistan free from terrorist hideouts, which also Dr. Meshulam will discuss? Then other three key questions. Dr. Meshulam will discuss how do you define terrorist violence vis-a-vis other kinds of violence? How did Afghanistan become a graveyard for empires, which all of the panelists will touch on? Were the only choices leaving the country or staying indefinitely, or were there other choices? And then Dr. Andrews will focus on women. And I quote the Taliban in this phrase: no prejudice against women will be allowed, but the Islamic values are our framework. So not necessarily in this sequence, but now let me give the floor to Dr. Andrews for the historical perspective. Dr. Andrews, the floor is yours.
Thank you. If you could just take off the screen.
Sure.
Thank you. It's just easier for me.
Yes.
Anyway, it's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to say hello to Dr. Nabi and Dr. Meshulam. And thanks for joining us on this panel. And I think before addressing the reasons, we could look into why the USSR and the US failed in their attempts to control Afghanistan. I think I'd like to start with looking at the idea of Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires, as it's often held to be a historical term, when really it derives from the media coverage of the first US campaigns against the Taliban in 2001. So it's not really a very historical term, not in a long-term historical perspective. For example, historian Alexander Haney Khalili points out that the first use of the term was in an article in Foreign Affairs in 2001. Both he and his fellow scholar, Nivi Machanda, whose book Imagining Afghanistan has been really useful to me in preparing this talk, suggests that its usage is an attempt to link the USA's, and by extension the USSR's, withdrawal from Afghanistan to past imperial projects, the British wars in the 19th century, most definitely, but also to the imperial greats of classic and pre-modern history, Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan. Marchanda further contests that the idea of Afghanistan as a graveyard for empire is designed to paint that nation as an intractable problem, as a country whose population has a millennial history of resistance to civilization and modernity, a barbarous other to Western democracy and freedom. In fact, for most of this history, the geographical space that we've just looked at on the map, which Afghanistan currently occupies, would better have been described as the Crossroads of Empire, for its position on the Silk Road and its strategic position between East and West, and its position between Central and the Middle East. It's integral part of trade routes and cultural routes. And so as a result, what is modern day Afghanistan has received and absorbed a great number of travelers, as Dr. Nabi has mentioned, some as invaders, yes, like the Moguls, and others as merchants, scholars, and religious leaders. It's been home to great civilizations like Bactria, which was founded after Alexander the Great had left the space that is now Afghanistan, and was a Greek state with great cultural value and great cultural learning, or the Kushan Empire, whose culture mixed the Indian, Greek, and Buddhist elements. Kushan's capital was in Bagram, and its territory spread into India and Central Asia at the beginning of the Common Era. This strategic importance of Afghanistan explains why it quickly became embroiled in the imperial ambitions, now jump into the 19th century, of the British and the Russians. Faced by two hostile powers, the Afghanistan, as it was forced to battle to preserve its independence and autonomy. And two wars with the British in the 19th century had the effect of bringing Afghanistan within the British sphere of influence as a client state rather than an occupied state, until the chaos unleashed by the First World War allowed the then kingdom to break free of British tutelage. And even so, after that, the British and now the new USSR remained powerful and very uncomfortable neighbours. So in the aftermath of the First World War, the Kingdom of Afghanistan under King Amanullah and then his successors sought support and investment from both powers, and after the Second World War also from the USA. And the aim there is to balance influence, and play one power against the other and preserve independence. As Afghan historian Shaistawab argues, part of this political project were various attempts to modernize Afghanistan, following first the Japanese example and later the Turkish examples. And these included the promotion of education at all levels and for both sexes, and repeated efforts to further women's rights, which became very controversial and created many problems. And was one of the factors which brought much instability to governments during the early 20th century. By the 1960s, Wahab suggests that the political conflicts that beset Afghanistan today had already been born. There was opposition to westernizing reform, that inspiring traditionalist and then fundamentalist Islamic groups who wished to fashion Afghanistan more along the lines of tribal custom and Muslim practice, while opposition to monarchical governments, and it has to be said, its repressions had also led to the development of other factions, including those with Marxist and communist leanings. This conflict between different groups and the monarchical government would open the door for the Soviet invasion in 1979. The monarchy was overthrown in 1973, creating the first Afghan Republic, and in 1977, communist groups organized the April or Saud Revolution, which overthrew the sitting government and set up the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. almost immediately, the new communist government's commitment to Marxism and its modernity, collectivizing land reform, secularism, and women's rights, provoked opposition within rural Afghan society. And in order to prevent the newest communist regime from collapsing in its infancy, the USSR decided to invade. And from this point on, Afghanistan did indeed become a graveyard, although not quite for imperial ambition, but for its own population. As Dr. Nabi has mentioned, the wars were extremely violent and extremely destructive. The communist government and the Soviet troops then really participated in what was one of the last hot conflicts of the Cold War against its domestic opponent, who were supported, as Dr. Nabi has just mentioned, by a coalition of outside powers. There is some disagreement on how many people died. I'm going to use the figure of getting over 1 million people as not to enter into the particulars, and at least 5 million people fled the country, and also a great number, thousands and thousands, were internally displaced within Pakistan. And as Dr. Nabi mentioned, the places these refugees went was Pakistan and Iran. The war also left vast areas of the country covered with unexploded landmines, destroyed agricultural lands and their irrigation systems, and left major urban centres like Kabul in ruins. It's in this context, for example, that Afghan farmers turned to growing opium poppies, which required less water and could survive in less fertile soil and with less care than traditional crops. And so what we have is a country that was, we could say, so culturally important in Central Asian history, with so many rich resources, a necessary stopping point on the commerce between China and Europe was brought to ruins by the Soviet invasion and the civil war which developed afterwards. And after, at this point, the intervention and the participation of other regional actors, not just the US, but Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran, and later on Al-Qaeda, of course, make what was the invasion of the Soviet Union and then the withdrawal of the Soviet Union to a civil war in which there are lots and lots of different interests at play, and lots of foreign money and armory and weapons that are brought in to Afghanistan. And so to return to the question that's posed, I would say that the short answer is that the militarization of society during the wars in the 80s and the 90s, the massive influx of weapons and armory which accompanied it, the immense destruction inflicted upon the country meant that once the Taliban had worked to take control at the end of the 90s, it was going to be a very difficult prospect for them to establish a centralized state or even to establish a monopoly of the use of force, which is the sine qua non of creating a successful state. And the US found this was, again, also the case. And I really don't think that the situation in that sense is very different than today.
Hello?
Hello, yeah, I finished.
Okay, you finished. That's great. Thank you for this great historical perspective, Dr. Andrews. We will go back to it in the Q&A. Meanwhile, I will go now to Mauricio Meshulam. I have to say that I am very pleased to have Mauricio in this conversation, not only because he is my fellow writer in the opinion pages of El Universal, but also because he's one of the foremost experts in Mexico on precisely the very issues that he will discuss now, the angle of terror and peace building. The floor is yours, Mauricio.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you very much, Jazz and Dr. Andrews. It's been a great perspective. And just before my brief presentation, a question we would like to hear from you, and of course we can discuss later on, is such an important geopolitical location and area and the crossroads between East and West and so forth. Now, what happens when the US is leaving that area and is leaving there a vacuum that will be taken advantage of possibly by other powers? That is a question that we need to discuss later on. Now, my focus here was after Carlos told me who was I sharing this panel with, I thought I would speak a little bit about peace, because the name of the talk today is The Road to Peace, right? And we are talking also about terror, which is one of the most important aspects that surround the atmosphere. This brief notes just, there is, I'm using a very brief synthesis from the Institute of Economics and Peace that actually synthesizes the whole theory on peace. And it defines two aspects of peace. One is called positive peace, and the second one is called negative peace. Negative peace is the absence of violence and fear of violence. That is negative peace. Positive peace is composed of attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. This is important because a true and lasting and sustainable peace is built on justice for all people. So the concept of positive peace involves the elimination of the root causes of war, violence, and injustice by creating and constructing or building institutions, structures, and attitudes that do sustain that peaceful society. And negative peace, which is only the absence of violence, may come as a peace without justice, which you can find states of absence of violence where there is no positive peace. And it can give or provide a false sense of peace. And it often comes as a cost of justice. In a negative peace situation, conflict may not be seen out in the open, but the tension may boil beneath the surface. The conflict was never reconciled. So if we are going to talk about the road to peace, we need to consider these aspects. Why? And let me focus on the area of fear. This is what research shows. I'm not citing, not providing all the references. We have a number of publications talking about this, but the more fear there is in a society, there is less support to democratic processes. There is less tolerance in those societies. There is less trust in justice institutions. There is less willing, the societies are less willing to respect other people's rights, and there is less support to peace processes. So the fear impacts the peace building growth, and also the absence of peace creates fear. So it creates an endless circles that promote each other. So what happens with Afghanistan and the terrorist groups that are the most active in the world? Let me just share with you the Global Terrorism Index. In 2018, you can see Afghanistan was the second with most terrorist activity in the world. 2019, Afghanistan was on top of the list. In 2020, Afghanistan was also, as you can see, on top of the list. If you go to the Global Peace Index, you will see, I'm not giving you all the Global Peace Indexes from the last years, just look at this one, and you can see Afghanistan in the bottom of the list, which means that according to these international measures, Afghanistan is the least peaceful country in the world, and it's also the country that has most terrorist activity. So we need to discuss at least a little bit about this type of terrorism that has happened in Afghanistan in the past years. Let me just make this brief difference. One type of terrorism, or one class of terrorism, is this international terrorism, in which Afghanistan was used as a safe haven for transnational organizations that planned international attacks. And according to Mr. Biden's discourse, this has been basically neutralized, because Afghanistan is no longer the safe haven for international organizations. Therefore, the US is safe from international attacks that are planned from the Afghan territory, which is okay. We could say that he might be right, but we need to look at this other type of terrorism. We need to distinguish, which is the terrorism committed against the Afghan society. And now let me just briefly respond to the question of Carlos. Not every type of violence is terrorism. Terrorism is a very specific category of violence, which doesn't mean that is the worst type of violence, because terrorism has been labeled as the worst violence possible and the most terrible type of violence. So everybody accuses each other of being the terrorism. And no, the US is the terrorist because the US uses drones and they kill civilians. And not every type of violence is terrorism. Terrorism specifically focuses on something. I'm not going to define it right now because this is not a class on terrorism. Just think of it as the targets. The targets in terrorism is not the direct victims. The unfortunate and always regrettable victims from terrorism are only used as instruments, as tools to create terror in third parties. The target in the terrorist violence is the third parties who receive the message through the terror. The terror is created, and then there is a message which is conveyed to the third parties in order to alter their perceptions, their opinion, their conceptions, their attitudes, their conduct, so that they can, a pressure is created so that decision makers alter their decisions regarding something that is related to a political target or a religious target or an ideological target, an ideological goal. So if I'm going to fight power such as the US or as the NATO, or I want to fight an army, I use this tool to create a sense of vulnerability in the society, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, so that this impacts psychologically the war that I'm fighting. Terrorism is psychological warfare, essentially. So the Taliban, those who are now governing, were the deadliest organization on the planet from terrorism during 2018 and 2019. The numbers of 2020 are just being released right now, so we don't have the indexes, but we need to guess that this tendency more or less continues. ISIS Khorasan, which is Wilayat Khorasan, which is the Afghan the Afghan filial, or the Afghan
branch.
Group, the Afghan branch, correct. The Afghan branch of ISIS was the second deadliest in Afghanistan during those years, according to statistics and numbers. But ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, or Eastern ISIS, has been most active in 2021. The United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan counted 77 attacks by ISIS-K fighters in the first 4 months of 2021 year alone, which is something that we need to take into consideration, because the terrorism that is perpetrated by the Taliban, we expect it to diminish in the coming months and possibly years. Depends on certain offshoots that may be unhappy, but we would expect that once that the Taliban is in power, or they are in power and they are controlling the country and they want stability and they want to rule and they want to continue ruling, the terrorism that they perpetrate will diminish a lot. It has diminished actually during this year, and in the monitors that we, in the indexes that we monitor, it has been diminishing a lot. Now, the terrorism perpetrated by ISIS-K, as you can see, has been increasing in this year alone. And ISIS-K is the branch that was responsible for the last terrorist attack by the airport in Kabul, and is expected to continue the fight. Why? Because ISIS-K originally was formed of either former Talibans, initially in Pakistan, either former Talibans or other people that want to follow the ISIS route. And this specific group has been competing against the Taliban and has been fighting the Taliban. The Taliban has been fighting ISIS-K for the past years. And they are now expected to continue the terrorist attacks because they want to create this sense of instability. They want to punch in the Taliban's face, and they want to continue their fight in the Afghan territory, using the Afghan territory. Now, there is this other discussion about terrorism and other local or regional groups that, of course, are in the concern of China, in the concern of Russia, in the concern of India, that Pakistan would be used by other local or regional groups, which are not necessarily related to the global jihad. And of course, there's this discussion that has been, there's positions in all senses that fear that Afghanistan could be used by transnational or global terrorist organizations once more. And there is a very interesting analysis that I recommend from Daniel Byman in Foreign Affairs very recently. He argues against it. He says that very probably the Taliban in 2021 will not allow Al-Qaeda or any other transnational terrorist organization to use the territory because it's not in their interest right now. Their interest is to last, and for that they need to negotiate, and they need to present themselves as a stable government that can actually rule the country through their principles, but they can actually rule the country. That is his position. It is something that we will have to monitor and we will have to view very, very closely. And of course, if we are going to talk about peace building with all the things that I talked about in the beginning of this short presentation, if we are going to talk about the creation of structures and institutions for peace, well, there is certainly a very negative impact from terrorism on that peace building, and that is something that needs to be taken into consideration as well. So I leave you the floor, Carlos, here so that we can continue.
Thank you, Mauricio. This is very illustrating, and as a matter of fact, I want to pick up on the last point, very important point you raised on the positive piece, because I read in your presentation, go to the root causes of injustice and violence, which is a language, which is a discourse that we also hear on migration, for instance, and on local and regional development in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, which experience probably a different kind of violence that also expel people And as we speak, the National Guard of Mexico is trying to contain, detain, and deport a group of migrants and asylum seekers that are trying to reach the United States because they fear, like you said, they fear that the violence upon them will even take their lives. So it's a matter of survival for them. Before we go to our audience, and I thank the three panelists for the great job they've done, let me go to Dr. Nabi with one overall question. Ijaz, you live in Pakistan, you're Pakistani, you live in an Islamic country. How do you feel about the very common, frequent, ordinary association of words that equates Islam with terror? How do you deal with that? Ijaz, if you're there.
I'll unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And we'll also try the video. Okay. Now, just a couple of words on what Mauricio said. I mean, that was a very insightful analysis of peace and terror, etc. But if we are seeking solutions in Afghanistan, we need to go beyond this narrow focus on terrorism alone. Afghanistan was an extremely peaceful country before the Soviet invasion. The incidence of violence in Afghanistan was very low. The borderland of Pakistan, which became the hub of terrorism after the Soviet invasion and later on when the Taliban government, when you map the evolution of violence trends in Pakistan, that borderland was the least violent area of Pakistan before all of this trend starts. So there is nothing inherently non-peaceful about these places, about these countries, about these cultures. This enormous intervention that has happened in Afghanistan and in Pakistan's borderlands has created the circumstances for violence. And I think we should remember that before we lump all of the problems of violence on specific cultures. Now, coming back to your question of how does Pakistan and how do I look at all this? As you well know, Carlos, I spend my time between Washington, D.C. and Lahore. So I move freely between these two environments. I'm amazed at the Islamic phobic lens that I see reflected even amongst the best newspapers of the United States. It's always a very, very narrow, focused lens with which events are being looked at and being analyzed. Look, for an effective state, you need three things. You need to provide security to people, you need to provide welfare to people, and you need to be representative of the people you govern. In 1991, when Taliban came into power, they were only able to deal with the first question of providing some element of security to those who subscribed to the Taliban rule. What we are hoping for now is that the international community and the regional countries, all of whose interests are that there'll be stability in Afghanistan, there'll be peace in Afghanistan, so that that peaceful peace that Mauricio was talking about, that there are huge returns to that peace that can be enjoyed in terms of connectivity, in terms of trade, in terms of energy supply lines, et cetera. So all the interests are aligned, and we have to ensure that Taliban this time are also able to deliver on the other two, and not just a stability which is enforced through harsh and brutal measures. The question that you posed is so large that it's hard to to pick a point to begin to address it, all I can say is that if you make it specific, for example, Sharia and women issue that you have mentioned in your, there is Sharia and there is Sharia. When you take the Islamic Sharia and you take it to Turkey, it means something very different.
Yes.
When you take it to Malaysia, it means something totally different.
When you take it to the Persian Gulf, and it means something different.
Yeah, and in Pakistan, what does it mean? In Pakistan's constitution says we will have no law that is in conflict with Sharia. So it's a totally different understanding of what Sharia is. In tribal societies, conservative societies, Sharia becomes a much more rigid concept. It manifests itself in ways that Pakistan's women would not like to live in, and certainly many Afghan women wouldn't want to live in. So what one hopes is that if Taliban are to succeed this time and have all the three elements, stability, welfare, and representation, that they will also represent the urban understanding of what Islam is, the urban understanding of what the role of women is. Only when Taliban are able to fulfill these three important elements of an effective state, I think the Taliban will be a different government this time around.
Thank you, Ijaz. Let me just take 1 minute to ask Dr. Andrews, Dr. Meshulam, whether they have something to add at this point in time before we go into Q&A, which will give you more time to discuss what you still have not been able to say. Dr. Andrews.
Yes, I think I'd like to say something about the situation of women in the sense that often it's thought, or seems to be thought from the outside anyway, from Mexico, from the US or Europe, that it could have been the Marxists in the 70s or the US in the 2000s that brought the idea of feminism and women's rights to Afghanistan. And I think I'd like to point out that the issue of a woman's awakening in the Islamic world is something that begins in the late 19th and early 20th century in Afghanistan, is not outside this moment. And so the idea of changes to traditional structures and traditional ways of women's participation in the home and society and how they should be dressed are not new themes and have been being discussed from the early 20th century. Queen Soraya, who was the wife of the king of Afghanistan in the moment of independence, she's the first woman to take off her veil. For example, she scandalizes the population by photographs of her visiting Europe with her arms uncovered, for example. There are numerous efforts by women in Pakistan, and mainly in urban areas, it has to be said, to change more cultural norms and to give women a greater role, more political rights, more access to education. In the 1960s, there are women studying in Kabul University. In the 70s, they play part in the communist revolution. Also, the women are involved in all aspects of the political world of Afghanistan by this point. In smaller numbers, perhaps, but they are involved. And so it's wrong to think that we are looking at some kind of new conflict between a traditional society and women's rights as brought in from outside. I think you have to think of what women in Afghanistan are doing and have been doing from the 60s and the 70s for themselves. One of the earliest women's rights groups in Afghanistan, the Association of Revolutionary Women of Afghanistan, was founded in 1977. Its leader was exiled from Afghanistan in the 80s and is rumored to, well, she was murdered, and the group believed that she was murdered by the Russians, for example. And this group still is operating in Afghanistan and in the refugee camps that were built in Pakistan in the 80s. And so if we're going to go to talk about women, I think we have to recognize that it's not a new thing, and it's not something that the US has brought into the equation. And we also have to question how much the US involvement in Afghanistan after 2001 and its involvement with the government of Afghanistan really made a big difference to how much difference it made to how women's lives was. There were great gesture politics, the signing of the UN Convention Against All Discrimination Against Women, for example. There was the promulgation of the law against violence against women, which was actually, if at all enforced with great success. There have been obviously differences, and there's obviously been greater in urban areas, specifically greater opportunities for women during the US-backed government. However, a recent article, I'm going to find her name because I've forgotten, a recent article by Sevgatullah Quasizada in 2020, like just last year, which was analysing how women's rights and women's rights to live without violence had been going in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, concludes with saying Afghanistan's regulatory, institutional and policy frameworks have failed to eliminate or even reduce violence against women. No? She argues that policies were imposed from a top-down manner from the government, and little attention was paid to addressing the social, economic, religious and cultural discriminations faced by women in Afghanistan. And women's groups like the Revolutionary Association of Women, the Women of Afghanistan, argue precisely against this model and say that the way to bring about a bettering of women's position in Afghanistan is through negotiation and through education and through addressing the social and economic aspects which maintain women in the position that they are today in Afghanistan. And so I think we have to also be very careful when we talk about this and not fall into the easy idea of thinking that the US came to bring rights to women in Afghanistan, and as they're leaving, it's all going to disappear. It isn't. I'm not arguing that the Taliban are going to be nice to women. It's very obvious from their history how they will go about their government and what their attitude to women is, and the future is very bleak in that perspective. However, I think I would like to argue very strongly against the idea that all was beautiful beforehand and that all problems had been solved and that women's rights and women were living free of violence during the US government.
Thank you, Dr. Andrews. I am cheering for you on this very powerful words at the end of your remarks. Mauricio, if you let me go to the couple of questions from the audience, which will give you a chance to respond and add onto your comments. We have one question from Katia Alexandra Sanchez. Her question is related to the role of Latin America in this conflict. Is there any predictable repercussion for Latin America? And if so, what do you think should be the role to be played by Latin American countries in this discussion? Mediator, observer, thank you. And the second question, and I will go to further questions and invite the audience. Quienes quieran incluir sus preguntas pueden hacerlo en el Q&A o en el chat. The second question is from Ambassador Jorge Alvarez. What are the incentives? Are there any incentives to embark upon a positive peace process? Do the Taliban have any incentives to embark upon a positive peace process now that they govern Afghanistan? Let me go to Mauricio if you want to elaborate on your own comments or respond to any of the two questions.
Thank you, and I will, of course, comment on the two questions, but possibly the most important thing regarding peace building is that it is really not only, it does not only consist of the absence of violence. You could say that Mexico was relatively a peaceful country, a very peaceful country before 2006 when criminal violence started. And actually what was boiling down in Mexico for the last decades was a very structural absence of peace, which resulted in what we have regrettably right now. So when we are talking about Afghanistan and peace building, we need to take into consideration past and present elements or factors. For example, you mentioned, Carlos, about the Mexican situation, and just so the very possibly the audience knows that Afghanistan is a country in which there is a huge organized criminal activity, a huge organized criminal activity, and is one of the most important drug traffickers of opium, and the Taliban have been involved in this trafficking with other actors, and it speaks about some of the issues that are very similar to our country in Mexico. It talks about, for example, the role of other aspects such as corruption, such as states, institutions, and inequality, and other areas that are related to peace, such as the respect of others or respect of the rights of other persons, which very clearly Dr. Ijaz mentioned right now. So what we need to focus in this discussion is about the possibilities that once that the US and the NATO are out, are there possible roads for these issues to be solved and built from bottom? Well, possibly, and going back to Ambassador's question, possibly the biggest incentive there may be, I'm not sure if it will materialize, but the biggest incentive will be their own survival, the Taliban own survival as the rulers of the country, and the need that they have right now to include these elements so that they can actually survive for a longer period and not become the attraction of international interests and so forth. That would be my comment right now, and I will leave the floor to the panelists to also, well, and the Latin American question is also interesting. What should be the role of countries of Latin America and Mexico? My argument has always been that Mexico, as one of the 15 most important economies in the world and a regional power, we do have something to say, and we do have a role to play in international matters. We now form part of the national Security Council at the United Nations, and we need to deal with this as an international matter, not only focus on our local area or regional area. That would be my
Thank you, Mauricio. And I'm going to ask now the panelists. I know you want to take the floor, but let me just read other questions before. I don't want to leave them out before we are out of time. There's one question by Sikaru Salud on the Taliban is calling for humanitarian organizations to stay in the country, but they depend mainly on United States and European Union financial support. Therefore, how do you see development is going to be financed in Afghanistan in the next years? Is it likely that the Taliban will accept Russian support? Another question by Manuel Lombera. In his address to the nation, President Biden pointed out yesterday new tools for foreign policy. He said no more military fighting should occur on the ground, but instead the United States should use diplomacy to spread democracy. How will this work with Afghanistan from now on? And then finally, we have from Felipe de la O, aren't Mauricio Mesulam's slides and bullet points of positive, negative peace and oversimplification of Kant's and Berlin's ideas of positive, negative liberty without the philosophical emphasis on autonomy, free will, and human rights? Shouldn't those ideas be taken with a grain of salt in an academic environment in order to avoid misinformation by oversimplification? So please take note of these questions, and I will open it up to Dr. Nabi.
Okay. Incentives for the Taliban. And I think this has to be, this is where the real skill will now come in, not just for countries in the region. Pakistan has a huge responsibility in this, not to overstress its own interests right now in Afghanistan, but also the United States. Afghanistan has about $6 to $7 billion in reserves sitting in the financial institutions in the United States. Those reserves have, as of now, have been completely stopped. Afghanistan does not have access to those reserves. IMF had a program. The tranche was going to be $350 million. That program is in suspension. World Bank has a huge annual lending program in Afghanistan. That is in suspension. External assistance was 40% of Afghanistan GDP. Whatever United States had done in the last 20 years had not resulted in a robust economy. External assistance still accounted for 40% of the GDP in Afghanistan. Now, how this is used, how the financial incentive, how the monetary incentive is used, is going to be part of the equation. Taliban, for the reasons that Mauricio mentioned, Taliban want peace, they want stability, they want to have a much better rule this time than last time. They need to demonstrate that by forming an inclusive government. And how we use the financial incentive has to be very much part of this delicate balance between walking away, which Clinton did, and the region suffered hugely from that walking away. I hope that will not happen, but there has to be some balance between saying, we are not talking to you because you're not doing enough, and here are the rewards that are yours. The region as a whole has a huge incentive to continue to push Taliban towards forming that inclusive government, because everybody will benefit from that stability. All the regional countries have a lot to lose if Afghanistan remains unstable. So that's the incentive there. I think these are welcome words from President Biden. The United States uses diplomacy. We know that, unfortunately, the interventions in the Middle East, the intervention in Afghanistan, all of these have had extremely bad outcomes, whereas the United States still has a lot to give to the world in terms of the knowledge of running governments, in terms of the knowledge of institution building, etc. But it has to be in a different mode and not accompanying this huge hammer of military intervention.
Thank you, Ijaz. Mauricio, before I go to you, and you will probably have to wrap up very soon, I just want to read the other questions that we have. Not that we will cover all of them, but I want to do justice to the people that raised them. Jesus Diaz, what legitimacy does the Taliban have in the wider Afghan population? There is an idea that the Taliban do have popular support. Felipe de la O, why are the speakers making such a strong emphasis on the idea of terror without trying to be empathic with the other side? Why do the speakers avoid mentioning the number of Afghans killed by the invading troops and human rights violations occurred during the last 20 years that have been fully documented by Human Rights Watch? And the link is included in the chat. Ivan Daphne Marin Gonzalez, could panelists give some bibliography? This is for you, Dr. Andrews. Could you provide some bibliography in order to go further in the historical and women perspectives about the theme? And finally, Lorenzo Lasso, what is the analysis of the panel regarding the increase of opium harvest and black market during US intervention? Why the US Congress approved a budget of $350 million a day on average during 29 years, 2 trillion in total. How come a country that received that amount of money still is so poor? Where did all the money go? Let me go to Mauricio Mechulam for final remarks.
Yes, just because I was mentioned regarding the framework from the Institute of Economics and Peace. The framework, of course, I did not have time to show the whole framework, the entire framework, but it is basically a framework based upon a number of indicators of the most peaceful countries during the last 15 years. It is a global indicator that is taken from the old schools of peace, the old philosophical and theoretical frameworks of peace, made into indicators to understand why some countries are more peaceful and what are the indicators that correlate with peacefulness. And they used 27 indicators for negative peace and 24 indicators for positive peace. And it is just a matter of measuring why. For example, let me give you these examples so that you can understand. The World Bank made a study and published in 2000 a very large study involving 30 countries and 60 countries and during 30 years, which understood that inequality, social inequality, is deeply correlated with violent crime. So in order to tackle violent crime, you need to tackle inequality as well. That is what this data shows. It is not, and this has been continued to being measured throughout these years. So in order to build a sustainable peace, you need to tackle all these indicators. It is not the intention to oversimplify. We would have to speak more about these indicators to understand why these are important. I will leave the floor to the other panelists so they can wrap up.
Thank
Carlos,
you. Yes,
Carlos,
yes.
One response. Because somebody said, where did the $2 trillion go? $2 trillion, 85 billion of those were spent in creating the Afghan army. At the end of the day, you have hundreds of thousands of Afghans desperate to leave the country because the United States is leaving. I have full empathy for the Afghans. They have suffered enough. But is this all United States can deliver at the end of 20 years and $2 trillion? That there are hundreds of thousands of Afghans wanting to leave the country to live down.
Thank you, Ijaz. Dr. Andrews, I've seen your references included in the chat. Do you want to take a minute for final remarks?
Well, I'd just like to say that I think that it's not just a question of empathy with what is happening in Afghanistan. I think I would like to echo what Dr. Nabi has just said. The war with the USSR, the later civil war, the war that the US was involved in, the violence that has continued to happen until the present day, and the figures that Dr. Mechulam showed us of where Afghanistan is positioned as a place of peace, as in the last place in the whole world, I think is testimony, evidence of the fact that the the situation that began in with the perhaps the invasion of the Soviet Union at the end of the 70s is a situation that is ongoing, and the violence, the destruction, the devastation that Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan have suffered until this point is unconscionable, and I think that it is a terrible, terrible example of how the Cold War and the later geopolitical arguments between the powers and the US and its interests in Asia and the Middle East is a terrible testament to how these ideas that may be conceived with great moral value or great moral arguments in reality produce suffering, death, devastation. And is there a road to peace in Afghanistan? Can only be once the devastation that has been wreaked is the work to reconstitute the country and to heal the violence that has been suffered by the people of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Dr. Andrews. I'm just going to give you just 1 minute for personal final remarks, and then we will have to wrap up. It's 9:19, 6:19 in Lahore, 6 p.m. 7:20 p.m. in Lahore. Ijaz, your final remarks, and then we wrap up.
Carlos, I think I've said just about everything I felt I needed to say in this forum. I just pray and I hope that that Taliban will be able to finally begin to address the kinds of issues and concerns that were just expressed, so that Afghans stop suffering, so that the country sees peace and the region sees peace. That's what all of us need to work towards, and outside military intervention is not the way to go.
Thank you. I will just one term that we have borrowed into the Spanish language, ojalá, inshallah.
Inshallah, yes.
Thank you all. Gracias, Mauricio. Gracias, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
so
much,
Ijaz.
Thank you.
And on behalf of CIDE, I want to thank our very distinguished panelists this evening, and thank you all, the participants, for your questions. We have learned a lot. It has been a very illustrative discussion. I have learned a lot. Have a good day, a good evening. Bye.
Good day to you, Carlos.
Thank